It was late October 2016. I had decided to go on a solo camping trip up in the hills near Dartmoor, in the southwest of England. I was 27 then, living alone in a small flat, working a job that left me drained and stuck in routines that felt the same every single day. I wanted silence. No emails, no people, no noise. Just me, a tent, and the sound of rain on canvas. I had camped a few times before, but never alone, and never that deep into the woods. The forecast that weekend had mentioned rain, but I didn't care. I liked the sound of it, especially when I was inside a tent. I packed my bag carefully. A small one-person tent, sleeping bag, headlamp, knife, some instant food, water, a small stove, and a rain jacket. I left my car parked along a dirt track about 2 miles from the camping area. Far enough that I wouldn't hear traffic, but close enough in case I needed to leave quickly. The sky had already started to darken when I began setting up my tent. The air smelled like wet grass and earth. There was that kind of cold that seeps into your fingers even before the real rain begins. By the time I had everything set, it had started raining, thin at first like mist, then heavier. The sound of raindrops against the tent was steady, tapping and uneven, sometimes breaking into fast bursts when the wind pushed through the trees. The ground was damp, and my boots sank slightly into the mud every time I stepped outside. I sat inside the tent, zipped up tight, eating from a tin of beans with my flashlight resting beside me. Everything felt calm. The rain grew louder, but steady. I read a little, then lay down in my sleeping bag and listened to the forest. It must have been around midnight when I woke up. The rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it was worse. The tent walls trembled slightly from the wind. I could hear the faint creak of tree branches moving. I shifted in my sleeping bag, trying to fall back asleep, but something felt off. There was this low sound underneath the rain, a kind of crunching noise, like someone walking slowly over wet leaves. It was faint, but steady enough that I knew it wasn't the wind. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer. I told myself not to overthink it, but the footsteps didn't fade or move away. They seemed to stop just outside my tent, maybe a few feet away. I froze completely. I could hear my own breathing. The rain softened for a moment, just enough that I could make out the sound more clearly. It wasn't random. It was slow, careful, like someone trying not to make noise. I didn't move for what felt like a full minute. The footsteps didn't come closer, but they didn't leave either. My flashlight was beside me, but I didn't dare turn it on. I waited, every nerve in my body on edge. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. Only the rain remained. I lay there, trying to convince myself it had just been my imagination, maybe branches shifting or something else. Eventually, after who knows how long, I must have drifted back into a light sleep. When I woke again, it was still dark. My phone said 3:42 a.m. The rain was lighter now, more of a drizzle. I noticed something strange the moment I looked toward the corner of my tent. One of the stakes holding the fabric tight to the ground was missing. The fabric sagged slightly, and the cold air was blowing in through that gap. I reached over, feeling around, and realized the peg hadn't just loosened. It had been pulled out. The line was lying several inches away, stretched tight like it had been yanked. I told myself maybe the ground had softened from the rain and it came loose, but it didn't look like that. It looked deliberate. The rest of the stakes were fine, firm, and in place. My heart was pounding. I zipped the tent up tighter and sat completely still, listening. The drizzle made everything sound distant and muffled. Somewhere out there, I thought I heard another faint crunch, farther this time. I stayed awake until the first hint of morning light started filtering through the trees. When the sun came up, I stepped outside. The forest looked heavy and soaked, branches glistening with raindrops. My breath fogged in the cold air. I walked around the tent slowly, inspecting the ground. That's when I saw it. A clear shoe print in the mud, right beside the corner where the peg had been pulled. Not a boot print, not a hiking shoe. It looked like an ordinary sneaker tread, small, maybe size 9 or 10. I crouched down, touching the edges. It was fresh, maybe a few hours old. I checked the area around the tent and found 2 more faint prints leading off toward the trees. I scanned the woods, my heart racing, but saw nothing. Everything was quiet except for the dripping of water from the branches. Whoever or whatever had been there had come close enough to touch my tent and then disappeared again into the darkness. I decided to pack up. I didn't want to stay another night there. It took me longer than usual because I kept stopping to look over my shoulder. The forest had this heavy silence to it. Not peaceful anymore, just tense. As I rolled up the tent, I kept thinking about how close someone must have been while I was asleep. Halfway through the trail back to my car, I found something else. There was a small clearing where the path widened a bit, and there, lying half covered in wet leaves, was a torn piece of blue tarp. It wasn't mine. It looked like part of an old shelter. Frayed at the edges, dirt-stained, with a bit of string still tied to one corner. Near it, I spotted an old can, rusted and bent, and a small pile of blackened stones from what looked like a campfire long put out. Whoever had been staying there had done so recently. The thought hit me then. Maybe someone was living out there. Maybe they'd seen my fire or heard me setting up and got curious. Or maybe they didn't want me near their spot. That idea made my stomach twist. I walked faster, keeping my eyes on the trail, gripping the knife I had in my jacket pocket, even though it probably wouldn't help much if someone really wanted to hurt me. When I finally reached my car, it was covered in a thin layer of mud splatter from the rain. I threw my gear in the back seat, jumped in, and locked the doors immediately. The forest around the parking spot looked empty, just gray trees fading into fog. But before I started the engine, I noticed something on my windshield. A smear, not dirt, not rain. A thin streak of what looked like greasy fingerprints dragged across the glass. 3 of them, faint but clear enough to see. I sat there for a long moment, staring at it. I hadn't touched the windshield since I parked. The rain should have washed any marks away. These were new. They were on the outside, right at eye level. I didn't wait any longer. I started the car, turned onto the muddy track, and didn't look back once. The tires slid a little on the wet ground, and the sound of the engine echoed through the quiet woods. I didn't breathe properly until I reached the main road and saw the first signs of houses again. When I got home later that morning, I left all my camping gear in the hallway. My hands were still shaking slightly. I went straight to the shower, but even with the hot water running, I couldn't get the image of that shoe print out of my mind. Whoever it was, they'd stood right next to me while I was sleeping, close enough to touch the tent, maybe watching, maybe waiting. A few days later, I checked an online forum for hikers in the Dartmoor area, just out of curiosity. Someone had posted about finding makeshift camps deep in the woods. Small shelters made of tarps and branches, signs of someone living rough out there, maybe hiding. Some said it was a homeless person. Others said it might be a man who'd been seen wandering the back roads nearby, refusing to talk to anyone. No one seemed to know for sure. I never went camping alone again after that. The sound of rain on canvas, which I used to love, doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It reminds me too much of that night. Lying awake, listening to footsteps outside my tent, knowing there was someone there in the dark, close enough that if I'd unzipped the tent even slightly, I might have seen their face. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted, but every time it rains now, that sound brings me back to that moment. The cold air, the sagging fabric, and that single shoe print in the mud, proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. I still think about that trip sometimes, even though I've tried to bury it deep in my mind. It was the summer of 2016. I was 27, working construction in Ohio, and needed a break from everything. I'd been meaning to go camping alone for years. Just me, my tent, and the woods. No phone, no people, no noise. I wanted quiet. I picked a spot in southern Indiana, near the Hoosier National Forest, where there was a small, unmarked trail that led down to a narrow river. I'd read about it on some online forum where people shared hidden camping spots. It wasn't an official site, which made it sound perfect to me. The drive there took about 4 hours. The last stretch of road was all gravel and dust. No signs, no houses, just trees swallowing the road from both sides. I parked my truck near a small clearing and followed a faint path downhill, carrying my backpack and tent. It was humid, the kind of sticky air that clings to your shirt. I could hear cicadas whining in the distance and the occasional crack of branches somewhere deeper in the forest. After walking for maybe half an hour, I found the river. It wasn't big, more like a long, winding stream about 10 feet across. The water was dark brown, probably from mud and rotting leaves, but it moved steadily. There was a flat patch of ground a few feet from the bank, perfect for pitching my tent. The spot was quiet except for the sound of running water and insects. I set up camp slowly, making sure everything was neat. Tent first, then the small fire pit with some rocks I gathered. I had packed light, just a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a folding knife, a small cooler with food, and a can of bug spray. Once I got settled, I sat by the river and watched the sun start to dip behind the trees. The air got cooler, and the forest changed sound. The cicadas quieted down, and other noises took over. Frogs croaking, the occasional splash from fish, and distant rustling that might have been deer. That first night felt peaceful. I cooked a small meal, sat by the fire, and listened to the woods. I remember thinking how nice it was to be away from people. When it got too dark to see beyond the firelight, I put out the flames, crawled into my tent, and fell asleep to the sound of the river. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the tent. It wasn't heavy, just steady. I rolled over and listened to it for a while before realizing I needed to pee. I unzipped the tent, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the wet night. The rain had made everything slick, and the air smelled of wet soil and leaves. I did what I needed to do, then stood there for a bit, shining my flashlight around. The forest looked different in the rain, more alive, somehow. My beam caught the mist hovering above the river, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving across it, like a dark shape gliding just under the surface. Could have been a fish or a log, but something about it felt off. It was too slow, too deliberate. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks in the light and went back inside. I zipped the tent and lay down again, but I couldn't fall asleep right away. The rain kept going, and I could hear occasional plops in the water, like something dropping stones into it. Eventually, I drifted off. When I woke up the next morning, the rain had stopped. The air felt cooler, and a thin layer of fog hung over the river. I got out and stretched, noticing that the ground near the water looked disturbed. The mud was torn up, like something large had been there during the night. There were deep impressions that looked like footprints, but not quite. They were long, narrow, and uneven. I squatted down to get a closer look, but the details were blurred by the rain. Probably a deer, I told myself, even though I'd never seen tracks shaped like that. I made coffee, ate a protein bar, and decided to explore upriver. I followed the bank for maybe half a mile, pushing through brush and ducking under low branches. The woods were thick but beautiful, tall trees with moss-covered roots and the sound of water echoing through the valley. After a while, I came across an old metal drum half buried in mud. It looked rusted and dented, maybe an old oil barrel. A few feet from it, I found a piece of torn blue tarp tangled in some branches. That wasn't unusual. People dumped all kinds of junk in the woods. But then I saw something else. A few yards away, behind a fallen tree, there was a shape that didn't look natural. At first, I thought it was another pile of trash, a soggy blanket or maybe a piece of clothing. But when I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a sleeping bag half buried in mud. I tugged at it and it came loose with a wet, sucking sound. The zipper was broken, and when I pulled it open, I saw what was inside. It took me a second to understand what I was looking at. The smell hit first, sweet, rotting, thick enough to make me gag. Inside the sleeping bag was the body of a man, or what was left of him. His clothes were shredded, skin bloated and gray. His face was mostly gone, eaten by time or animals, but I could still make out part of his jaw and some teeth. One arm stuck out awkwardly, bone showing through torn flesh. I froze. My brain stopped working for a few seconds. I don't even remember breathing. I dropped the flashlight and stumbled backward, almost slipping into the mud. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy. I just stood there, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I grabbed my flashlight and backed away slowly, then turned and walked fast, almost running, back toward my camp. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I started packing up right away, tossing everything into my backpack, not caring if it fit right. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Across the river, on the opposite bank, there was another tent. A small green one. I hadn't seen it before. It looked old, maybe abandoned, but there was smoke rising from what looked like a dead campfire beside it. Someone had been there recently. I froze again, staring across the water. The tent was maybe 50 feet away, hidden partly by trees. I didn't see anyone, but I had this awful feeling that someone was watching me from over there. The woods felt too quiet. I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my pack, threw everything into the truck, and drove out as fast as I could, following the muddy road until I hit pavement again. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station nearly an hour away. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. Inside the station, I told the clerk there'd been a dead body by the river. He called the police, and within half an hour, I was sitting in a small office talking to deputies. They asked me to show them exactly where it was, so I went back with them. When we got there, the body was still there, just like I'd left it. But the tent across the river, it was gone. Nothing but wet grass and a few footprints near the water's edge. The officers looked around but didn't find much. They told me to stay in town while they investigated. Later, I learned that the man had probably been dead for weeks, maybe even months. They didn't release his name publicly right away. What stuck with me, though, was something one of the officers said quietly while filling out his notes. He mentioned that there had been another report a few years earlier. Someone had gone missing near that same river, same stretch of woods. A hiker who'd been camping alone. They never found him. I didn't stay to hear the rest. I drove straight home that night and haven't gone camping since. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake, I think about that green tent across the river, about how there was smoke still curling up from that campfire. Whoever had been there was close enough to hear me, maybe even see me find the body. I still don't know who they were, or if they're the one who left that man in the sleeping bag. But every time it rains, and I hear that slow tapping sound on the window, it takes me back to that night in the woods. The sound of water, the smell of rot, and the quiet feeling that someone was standing just beyond the trees, watching me the whole time. I went camping alone in northern Minnesota in late September of 2019. The plan was simple: 2 nights near a small lake called Red Pine Lake, about 4 hours from Duluth. It wasn't my first solo trip, but it was the first time I'd gone that far off trail. I wanted to be completely alone, away from noise and people. I had just quit a stressful job, and I thought a few quiet nights in nature would clear my head. The weather was perfect when I started. Cool air, blue skies, the sound of dry leaves crunching under my boots. I parked my car near an old forest road that wasn't used much anymore. The trail wasn't even marked. It was just a faint line in the trees that I followed using an offline map on my phone. I hiked in for about an hour, maybe a little more, until I found a clearing by the edge of the lake. The water was still, reflecting the sky like glass. I set up my tent near a few tall pines and started gathering firewood. Everything felt calm. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. The forest turned quiet in a way that almost felt unnatural. No wind, no frogs, no crickets, just complete stillness. I ate a can of chili by the fire and watched the flames twist in the dark. I wasn't scared then, just aware of how isolated I was. My phone had no signal, but I didn't care. That was the point of coming here. I went to bed early, lying inside my sleeping bag listening to the soft creaks of the trees. I slept fine for the first few hours, but sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The woods were quiet again, but something felt wrong. There was a smell, something sharp and rotten, like dead fish mixed with metal. I figured maybe a raccoon had dragged something near the camp, so I unzipped the tent and looked outside. The fire was just glowing embers now. The smell was stronger, thick in the air. I aimed my flashlight around, slow and careful. That's when I saw it. A dark shape lying a few feet away from the tree line. At first, I thought it was a large animal, maybe a deer that had died. But when I stepped closer, I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. The light hit pale skin, torn clothing, and what looked like dried blood along the ground. I could see one arm twisted unnaturally, the hand curled near the face. The smell hit me full force then. It was the unmistakable stench of decay. The body had been there for a while, but not long enough to be just bones. My stomach turned. I stepped back, shaking. My first thought was that I had stumbled onto a murder or a missing hiker. Either way, I needed to leave. I grabbed my phone and camera, took a few quick pictures from a distance, proof that I hadn't done anything, and backed away toward the tent. My hands were trembling as I packed my backpack. I planned to hike out as soon as the sun rose, but I couldn't sleep after that. Every sound in the forest made my pulse jump. I kept picturing the body lying there, the face half buried in leaves. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something moving near the tree line again. It wasn't the wind. It was slow, steady steps, like someone walking barefoot over leaves. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The sound stopped for a moment, then came closer. I killed my flashlight and waited in the dark. My eyes adjusted enough to see faint outlines. The trees, my tent, the dead shape on the ground. Nothing moved. I waited for almost an hour, frozen in place. The steps never came again, but I could swear I heard shallow breathing somewhere nearby. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. When I woke up, it was early morning. The air was cold, and the mist hung low over the lake. I got out of the tent and looked toward the spot where the body had been. It was gone. Just a dark patch of disturbed leaves and mud remained. My chest tightened. I looked around, half expecting to see drag marks or footprints, but the ground was too uneven to tell. I told myself maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or my tired brain. But I knew what I saw. There was no mistaking the smell or the shape. I quickly stuffed my gear into my pack and started back toward the trail. I walked fast, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods felt different now, like they were watching me. After maybe half a mile, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were small torn bits of fabric stuck to the branches on both sides of the path. Brownish red stains on the bark, like someone had brushed against the trees while bleeding. I moved faster, breathing hard. The woods were quiet again, except for the sound of my boots on the dirt. At one point, I saw a boot print ahead of me in the soft soil. It wasn't mine, I could tell from the pattern. The tread was deeper and wider, and it looked fresh, pointed in the same direction I was heading. I don't know why, but I started running. My pack bounced on my shoulders, and every shadow looked like someone standing there. I didn't stop until I reached the dirt road where my car was parked. The sight of it felt unreal, like I had escaped from something that didn't want me to leave. When I got in, I locked the doors immediately and just sat there for a few minutes, shaking. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. Then I started the car and drove straight to the nearest ranger station, which was about an hour away. I told them what I saw: a body by Red Pine Lake, the smell, the missing remains by morning. They took me seriously at first, asked me to mark the area on a map. A few hours later, I got a call from one of the rangers. They'd gone out there with a team. They said they didn't find any human remains, just some torn clothing and what looked like animal bones scattered around. They figured it was a coyote kill or maybe a bear. I told them that wasn't what I saw, but they didn't push it. They said it happens. People see strange things alone in the woods. Fatigue, shadows, imagination. I went home that same day, but the image of that body never left my head. For weeks, I couldn't sleep properly. I kept checking the photos I took, but they didn't show much. Just darkness, trees, and what looked like a shape lying on the ground. Could have been anything, really. Still, I knew what I saw wasn't an animal. About a month later, I read a short news piece online about a missing man from Duluth. His last known location was somewhere near Red Pine Lake. He'd gone hiking alone and never came back. The article mentioned search teams finding a few personal items, a torn jacket, a boot, but no body. That was when I stopped reading. I closed the page and sat there for a long time. It hit me then that maybe what I saw that night wasn't a hallucination. Maybe I really did find him and something or someone moved him before I woke up. I haven't gone camping alone since then. I still love the woods, but I can't shake that memory. The smell, the pale skin, the way the forest went silent that night. Sometimes I dream about walking through that clearing again, the lake glass still and the fire burning low, and I see the shape lying there in the dirt, waiting for me to notice it all over again. When I wake up, I can almost smell it, that same sharp, rotten scent. And for a few seconds, I feel like I'm still there, kneeling by the trees, flashlight trembling in my hand, staring at something I was never meant to find. It was July of 2014, and I had taken a solo camping trip in the Peak District in England. I was 27 back then, working long hours in a warehouse job near Sheffield. I needed to get away from everything for a while, so I packed my small tent, some food, and my old hiking boots, and drove out toward the hills early one Saturday morning. The weather was cloudy but warm, the kind of dull English summer day where the air feels heavy and the clouds just hang there. I didn't really plan much, just wanted to walk until I found a quiet spot and camp out for a night or two. I parked my car near a narrow country lane that curved through empty farmland, then started walking up through the trails. The grass was long, brushing against my legs as I followed a faint path that cut through heather and ferns. After about an hour of walking, I found a good place to set up camp near a small wooded area. There was a slope leading down to a stream, and it felt far enough from any main paths that I'd have peace and quiet. By late afternoon, I had my tent pitched, a small fire going, and the quiet sound of water running nearby. The air smelled of wet soil and grass. I cooked a bit of instant noodles on my camping stove, watched the steam rise, and felt that calm you only get when you're far from everything. I remember lying back against my bag, just staring at the uneven hills fading into misty gray. I stayed there for hours doing nothing. When the evening came, The air grew colder and the light dimmed. It wasn't dark yet, but the sun was buried behind a thick layer of cloud. I decided to take a short walk down the hill toward the stream before it got too dark. The ground was damp, and I could hear the soft crunch of my boots in the grass. I didn't bring a flashlight since I wasn't going far. The sound of the water grew louder as I got closer, and I crouched near the bank for a while, watching how the current moved between the stones. That's when I noticed something odd. Across the stream, maybe 40 feet away, there was a narrow clearing between the trees. It was shaded and darker on that side, but I could just barely make out what looked like a small structure, maybe a shed or some kind of old cabin. The wood looked gray and rotted, half covered by ivy. It didn't look lived in. I thought maybe it was a farmer's storage hut or an old shelter left from years back. I didn't think much of it then. I turned back to my tent as it got darker, zipped myself in, and laid in my sleeping bag listening to the sounds outside. Crickets, soft wind, the distant trickle of water. Everything felt peaceful for a while. It must have been close to midnight when I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I just opened my eyes and felt uneasy. It was completely dark except for the faint outline of the tent fabric when lightning flashed somewhere far off in the distance. I sat still for a moment trying to listen. The rain hadn't started yet, but I could hear something faint outside, a soft rustling. Not an animal, not the wind. It was steady, slow, like footsteps. The sound moved past my tent, just a few feet away, then stopped. I stayed completely still, my breath shallow. My mind tried to make sense of it. Could be a deer, I thought, maybe even a fox nosing around. I told myself to calm down, but after a few seconds, I heard it again. Not moving now, just standing there. The air inside my tent felt thick, my heart beating so loud I was sure it could be heard outside. I waited maybe 2 minutes before I finally reached for my phone. The screen's light nearly blinded me in the dark. It was 12:47 a.m. I switched on the flashlight, but I didn't unzip the tent. I aimed it toward the fabric to see if any shadow showed outside. For a moment, nothing. Then, faint but clear, I saw the shape of legs standing just a few feet away. I froze. Whoever it was didn't move, just standing there, facing my tent. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe more. Then the figure slowly turned and walked away, back toward the trees. I heard the footsteps fade into the distance, and eventually there was nothing but the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there with the light on, waiting for morning. When daylight finally came, I got out and checked around. The grass near my tent was flattened in a few places. Definitely footprints. They weren't animal prints. I followed them down the slope toward the stream, and they led right up to the edge of the water, then stopped. Across the stream, I saw that same clearing and that old shed again, clearer now in daylight. The door was slightly open. Curiosity got the better of me. I crossed the shallow part of the stream, water soaking into my boots, and walked toward the structure. The closer I got, the more it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was splintered and gray, the door hanging crooked. Pushed it open. Inside, there was an old chair, some broken glass bottles, and scraps of fabric on the floor. It smelled of damp rot and something faintly sour, like spoiled meat. Then I noticed something in the corner. A small pile of burnt paper and what looked like a melted candle. There was also a sleeping bag, filthy and ripped open, and a few cans of food stacked beside it. Someone had been staying there recently. I turned and walked straight back to my tent, packed everything up in record time, and started heading back toward where I'd parked. The entire way I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone on the trail. The woods felt different now. Quieter but tense, like everything was holding its breath. When I reached the car, I threw my gear into the back seat and just sat there for a few minutes trying to calm down. I remember looking up through the windshield toward the hills. From that distance, the area looked peaceful, almost harmless. It was strange to think that just a few hundred meters away, someone had been walking around my tent in the middle of the night. I drove straight into town and stopped at a small cafe. The woman at the counter asked if I'd been camping. I nodded, said I'd been up by the moors. She told me a lot of rough sleepers and wanderers stayed out there sometimes, especially near abandoned farm buildings. Some of them, she said, didn't like people getting too close to their spots. That stuck in my head all day. It made sense, but it didn't make me feel any better. Whoever that man was, he must have been watching me long enough to know where I'd set up. Maybe he was living in that shed and saw my fire from across the stream. Maybe he came over to check what I was doing, maybe to scare me off. I'll never know. That night, back in my flat, I kept thinking about that moment when I saw the shadow of his legs through the tent. The way he didn't move for so long. He must have been staring at the tent, maybe trying to decide something. It wasn't random footsteps in the night. He was standing there, right outside, in complete silence. I didn't go camping alone again after that. I still like the outdoors, but I stick to proper campsites now with other people around. Sometimes, when I'm driving through the countryside and I see a patch of woodland off the road, I think about that night in the Peak District. How small that tent felt, how quiet it was, and how close he must have been. I realized later that what scared me most wasn't that he might have tried to hurt me. It was that he didn't say or do anything, just stood there, watching, like I wasn't supposed to be there at all. That kind of silence stays with you. Every time I picture it, I see that faint outline of his legs outside the tent, the fabric slightly moving with the wind. And I always think how lucky I was that he eventually walked away. If he hadn't, nobody would have even known where to start looking for me out there. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 23, and I just bought a used pickup that I'd been dying to take out somewhere quiet, far away from people. I'd been working too many hours at a warehouse job in Phoenix, and the idea of driving up into northern Arizona, where the forests were thick and the air felt alive, sounded like exactly what I needed. I picked a spot near the edge of Coconino National Forest, not one of those crowded campgrounds, but a patch of land I'd found marked on an old topographic map. It was a few miles off a dirt road, tucked behind a ridge that kept it hidden from the main trail. I got there late afternoon, parked the truck under some tall pines, and hiked in about half a mile before setting up my tent. The place was completely still except for the wind brushing through the branches. No voices, no distant cars, just the sound of the forest breathing around me. I gathered some firewood before the light went down and sat on a log while the fire crackled low and slow. The forest at night had a rhythm to it. Crickets, the occasional snapping branch, a far-off owl. I liked that silence between the sounds. It reminded me of being a kid when my family used to camp before life got too busy. I made some instant noodles, stared into the fire for a long time, and then crawled into my sleeping bag. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I woke up. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized something had changed. The sounds were gone. The crickets had stopped. It was so quiet that I could hear my heartbeat thumping in my ears. I stayed still, trying to listen, thinking maybe an animal had wandered close by. Sometimes the forest just goes silent when something big is around. Then I heard a crunch. It came from behind my tent. A single, slow step on dry leaves. Not fast or aggressive, but heavy enough to know it wasn't a raccoon. My first thought was a deer, maybe even an elk, since they were common around there. But the next step sounded wrong. It wasn't the kind of four-legged shuffling noise I was used to hearing. It sounded more like someone walking, slow, dragging steps that pressed into the dirt. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. I told myself it was nothing, maybe my mind playing tricks after waking up half asleep. I waited a few minutes, then reached for the small flashlight next to my sleeping bag and clicked it on. The beam shook slightly from my hand, cutting through the thin nylon of the tent. I didn't see a shadow or any movement. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, light still on, trying to calm myself down. When I finally drifted back to sleep, I woke again a few hours later to pale light sneaking through the tent. Morning had come and everything looked normal. The forest was alive again, birds calling, insects buzzing. I laughed at myself for getting scared. I made some coffee, packed my backpack, and decided to explore a bit around the ridge. I walked for a while, crossing patches of damp earth and thick undergrowth, until I found a shallow ravine where an old, dry creek bed ran through. That's when I saw something odd in the dirt. Prints. At first, I thought they were just deer tracks, but they didn't look right. They were shaped like human footprints, but the stride was uneven, longer on one side, like someone walking with a limp. And they weren't wearing shoes. The ground was dry enough that I could see the details. Long toes, wide soles, and strange pressure points, as if the weight wasn't spread normally. I followed them for a bit before they disappeared near a pile of dead branches. I felt that uneasy weight in my chest again, the same one from last night. I turned back toward camp, telling myself I was overthinking. Probably some local hiker or someone living off-grid. People did that out here sometimes. The rest of the day went fine. I fished in a nearby stream, gathered more firewood, and relaxed near the tent as the sun dipped behind the trees. The sky turned a deep orange, and I remember thinking how peaceful it felt. The kind of quiet that made you forget how far from civilization you were. But when night came again, that peace didn't last. Around midnight, I woke up to the same silence, the kind that feels thick, like the air itself is holding its breath. I sat up, every nerve on edge, listening. Then came the steps again, but this time closer. They circled the tent. Slow, deliberate, almost careful. I could hear the crunch of dry needles and the faint scrape of something brushing against fabric. I froze completely. My flashlight was right next to me, but I didn't grab it this time. I just sat there, trying to make out what it was doing. The steps stopped right behind my head. For a moment, I thought I heard breathing, long, uneven breaths, like someone exhaling through their nose. My skin crawled. I was seconds away from unzipping the tent and bolting to my truck. But I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then, just as slow as it came, it moved away. The steps faded into the distance until I couldn't hear anything at all. I stayed awake until the first light of morning. When I finally stepped out, the ground behind the tent was covered in more prints. The same barefoot tracks I'd seen near the creek. But these were deeper, fresher. I crouched down, studying them, and noticed something that made my stomach twist. They weren't just human-like. The toes looked elongated, like fingers pressed into the soil. And the distance between each step was too long, even for someone tall. I packed my things right then. I didn't even make breakfast. I threw everything into my pack and hiked straight back to my truck. The forest looked different in the morning light. Emptier, colder. The air felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The drive out took longer than it should have. Every turn of the dirt road made me look into the mirrors, half expecting to see something in the tree line. When I finally hit the highway, I stopped at a gas station in Flagstaff to breathe. I remember walking into the restroom, splashing cold water on my face, and noticing dried mud smeared on the back of my leg, the same dark soil from behind the tent. I hadn't been near that spot after I woke up. I drove home and didn't tell anyone about it for a while. I kept thinking maybe it was a person, some stranger living off in the woods, maybe watching campers for whatever reason. I even went online to check if there were any missing people or strange reports in that area. There were a few vague stories about hikers hearing mimicking voices and seeing a man walking on all fours, but I ignored that stuff. It all sounded exaggerated. But what stuck with me wasn't the noise or the prints. It was the silence. The way the entire forest went dead when it was near, like nature itself refused to acknowledge it. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never without a weapon nearby. Every now and then, I'll wake up in the middle of the night, and that same silence hits me, thick, hollow, and too still to be normal. When it happens, I always listen for those slow, dragging steps. So far, I haven't heard them again. But whenever I drive past Coconino and see that stretch of trees lining the road, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there. Not something from stories or legends, but something real, something that walks like us, looks almost like us, but isn't one of us at all. And I don't think it ever really left me alone. I had been planning this trip for months, and there was no way I was going to back out. The Amazon jungle was calling me, an adventure I couldn't turn down. I was 28, an experienced camper, and while I had hiked through plenty of national parks, this felt different. The rainforest was a whole different beast. I didn't know what to expect, but I was determined to make it out alive, having experienced something most people only read about. It was late February when I landed in Manaus, Brazil, with my gear packed tightly. I was set for a 5-day trek into the jungle. I had the map, the supplies, and a guide who was supposed to meet me on the outskirts of the city. But he never showed up. That didn't sit well with me. I waited around for hours, hoping he'd show up, but eventually, the small crowd of people I was with started to thin out. I could sense a strange hesitation in the air, a tension I couldn't place. I'd read stories of people getting lost out there, even with experienced guides. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I stared at the dense tree line just outside the clearing, but the temptation to go on was too strong. By late afternoon, I decided to head in on my own. I had enough survival skills to last me at least a couple of days, and I didn't want to waste any more time in a foreign city. Besides, it was more thrilling this way. The thought of walking alone through the thick, mysterious forest was too exciting to ignore. I trekked for hours, cutting through the dense underbrush with my machete, the sound of the forest swallowing up the noise of my footsteps. I couldn't help but admire the majesty of it all. The towering trees, the deep green leaves, the strange calls of unseen creatures. The Amazon was alive in ways I had never imagined. But as night began to fall, something shifted. The air grew heavier, thick with humidity. The once comforting chirps and howls of the jungle faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. My heart began to race. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, silence in the jungle was to be expected at night. I set up camp, a small fire crackling as I prepared my meal, but the quiet lingered. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves, but even that felt off. It wasn't until the third night that things started to get really strange. I had been hiking for 2 days, heading deeper into the jungle, and I was starting to feel the weight of the isolation. My food was running low, and the map I had brought wasn't as clear as I hoped. I found a spot to camp, near a creek that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. I had set up my tent and was just about to eat when I heard it. A low growl. It was so faint, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I stood still, straining my ears, listening. The growl came again, this time louder, closer. My heart thudded against my ribs. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my machete and slowly stood up, peering into the darkness around me. The dense trees blocked out any stars, the moonlight just a thin sliver peeking through the canopy. I couldn't see anything. The jungle was completely still. Then, the sound came again, this time much louder and unmistakably coming from the brush just ahead of me. Something was out there, something big. I didn't move, not wanting to alert whatever it was to my presence. I wanted to believe it was just a jaguar or some other big animal, but the growl didn't sound like anything I had ever heard before. I kept my eyes trained on the darkness ahead, waiting, and in the dead silence that followed, I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, like something was circling my camp. I didn't dare make a sound. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, the sound stopped. There was nothing but silence again. I stayed frozen, every muscle tense, waiting for something to happen. But after a while, I had to admit that it was gone, whatever it was. I spent the rest of the night staring into the darkness, my hand never leaving the machete's hilt. But no more sounds came. I eventually fell into a fitful sleep, waking up every few minutes, checking the perimeter of my camp. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted. I packed up quickly, determined to move on and get out of the area. I wasn't sure what had been out there, but I had no desire to find out. The last thing I wanted was to encounter whatever made that sound again. But as the day wore on, things only got stranger. I kept seeing flashes of movement in the distance, shapes darting between the trees. I thought it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me, but the unease continued to grow. The air was thick and oppressive, and the jungle around me seemed to close in on itself, as if it was alive, watching me. That night, I found another spot to camp, but this time I was much more cautious. I set up my tent close to the creek, just in case I needed to make a quick escape. I didn't want to go to sleep, but my body betrayed me, and I fell into an uneasy slumber. I woke up to the unmistakable sound of something moving around my camp. My eyes shot open, and I could see a shadow pass by my tent. It wasn't human. The shape was too large, and it didn't move with the same kind of fluidity I was used to seeing in animals. My heart raced, and I grabbed the machete, trying to control my breathing. The tent was too thin. I knew whatever it was could hear me. Then I heard something I'll never forget. A whisper. It wasn't a voice, but a sound. An almost inaudible hiss that seemed to come from all around me. I pressed my back against the wall of the tent, too scared to move. The whispering grew louder, though it didn't form words. It was like a language I couldn't comprehend, a language that felt wrong. I knew then I wasn't just dealing with some wild animal. This was something else, something that had been watching me since I first entered the jungle. The whispers continued for what felt like hours, until they abruptly stopped. I lay there, terrified, not daring to make a sound. My only hope was that it would leave. But then I heard footsteps again, this time louder, more deliberate, circling my tent. I could feel the earth tremble with each step. When morning finally came, I packed up my gear faster than I had ever packed before. I had to leave. There was no way I was staying in that place another night. The jungle felt alive, and I was just a small part of it. A tiny, fragile thing walking through a world much older than me. I made my way back toward Manaus, not daring to stop for rest. I didn't look back, not even once. Whatever I had experienced out there, I didn't want to understand it. Couldn't. When I finally made it back to the city, I was exhausted, dirty, and mentally shaken. I tried to tell people what happened, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. "It's the jungle," they said. "You're not the first person to feel its power." I don't know if I believe in the supernatural or if my mind just broke under the pressure of the Amazon, but I do know one thing. There is something in that jungle, something I'll never truly understand, and I'll never go back to find out. I'm just thankful I made it out. It was the summer of 2013, and I had just turned 23. I wanted a break from the constant noise of the city, the traffic, the lights that never dimmed, and the same faces I saw every day. I was working at a warehouse back then, long hours and barely any rest, so when I finally got a week off, I decided to go camping alone. I'd done it a few times before, but always with friends. This time, I wanted silence. Just me, the woods, and nothing else. I picked a spot in the Lake Superior Provincial Park area in Ontario, Canada. It wasn't a busy camping season, and that was part of the appeal. The area was known for its rugged beauty: cold blue water, thick pine forests, and cliffs that caught the last light of the evening like something out of a painting. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, fishing rod, canned food, and an old camera. I drove up in my beaten-down Honda Civic, the kind that shook a bit when it hit 70 miles an hour. The drive took almost 10 hours from Toronto. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already dipping low. I hiked for about 2 hours into the woods before I found a clearing close to a small lake. It was quiet. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I set up camp, made a small fire, and cooked a can of beans. The stillness was calming in a way I hadn't felt in years. The only sounds were the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional splash of fish in the lake. The first night went fine. I woke up once when I heard what I thought was a branch snapping near my tent, but I figured it was an animal. I turned over and fell back asleep. The second day was peaceful. I hiked deeper into the woods, took pictures of trees and small streams, and fished by the lake. I didn't catch much, just one small trout, but it didn't matter. It was about being away. I spent the rest of the day reading on a camping chair, feeling the wind move through the trees. That evening, though, something started to feel different. As the sun went down, I felt this strange stillness settle over the woods. The birds stopped calling. Usually, around sunset, you could hear them all over, but that night it got quiet really fast. I remember the silence feeling heavy, like the air itself was thicker. I put more wood on the fire and tried not to think much of it. I told myself it was probably just the wind changing direction or something, but the quiet didn't lift. When it got dark, I started to feel this weird pressure in my chest, like I wasn't supposed to be there anymore. Around 11 p.m., I was sitting near the fire, and that's when I noticed something on the other side of the lake. It wasn't far, maybe 100 meters across. First, it looked like a shadow. Then I realized it was a person, a man standing near the treeline. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the water. I remember staring for a long time, trying to convince myself it was a tree or a rock. But it wasn't. It was a man. I couldn't see any details, but I could tell by the shape. I felt this jolt in my stomach. My mind started racing, trying to explain it away. Maybe another camper, maybe someone hiking, but there were no other tents or lights anywhere near me. I hadn't seen anyone the entire time I'd been there. The man didn't move. I sat there frozen, staring, until I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it across the lake. The light hit the trees, the water, and then the figure. The man was tall, wearing something dark. I couldn't make out his face. The moment the light touched him, he turned and walked back into the woods. Not fast, just walked, like he wasn't in any hurry. That's when I felt real fear. Something about how calm he was, it didn't make sense. I sat there for a long time, heart pounding, watching the tree line. Nothing moved after that. Eventually, I went inside my tent and zipped it shut. Couldn't sleep. Every small noise outside made me flinch. I kept checking my watch. Midnight. 1, 2. By 3 in the morning, I must have drifted off, but it wasn't real sleep. When I woke up, it was morning. The sunlight made everything seem normal again, like maybe I'd imagined it. I tried to shake it off. I made coffee, ate some oatmeal, and went down to the water to wash my face. That's when I saw footprints. Not mine. Across the lake, on the muddy edge near the trees, I could see clear boot prints leading out of the woods and stopping right at the waterline. I stood there staring for a long time. They were fresh. I could tell because the edges were still clean, not weathered or filled with water. It looked like someone had been there maybe a few hours earlier. That day, I decided I'd leave the next morning. I didn't want to rush out right then. It was a long hike back to the car, and I didn't want to be caught in the woods after dark. I spent the rest of the day close to camp, didn't fish, didn't explore, just sat near the fire listening. By evening, the same quiet started again. The woods just went dead silent like the night before. I felt that pressure in my chest again. I kept my flashlight close and stayed awake by the fire as long as I could. Around 1 a.m., I started hearing soft crunching sounds in the distance. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the steps were too slow, too steady. It wasn't the quick movement of a deer or raccoon. It was footsteps, human ones. They came closer. I could hear them moving around the trees, stopping every now and then. I turned my flashlight toward the noise, but there was nothing, just darkness and trees. Then I heard another sound, metal clinking, faint but sharp, like something brushing against a belt buckle or a tool. I froze. The fire had burned low, and I didn't want to move. My throat felt dry, and every instinct told me not to make a sound. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour until the noise stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning came, I packed everything fast. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out. The hike back felt longer than before. I kept looking behind me, half expecting to see someone. A few times, I thought I heard movement, but when I turned around, there was nothing. When I reached the parking area, my car was there. Nothing looked touched. But when I opened the driver's side door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was dirt on the handle. Not just dust. Mud. Smeared like someone with dirty hands had grabbed it recently. I hadn't noticed it before. I looked around. The whole lot was empty. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking. The whole drive back, I kept checking my mirrors. Every car behind me made my pulse race. I didn't stop once, not even for gas, until I was well into the next town. I never went camping alone again after that. For months, I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking I heard footsteps outside my window. I don't know who that man was or why he was out there watching from across the lake. But sometimes, when I think back on it, what scares me the most isn't that he was there. It's how calm he was, like he'd done it before. And sometimes, I still wonder if he followed me back through the trees that morning, watching from a distance, just close enough to see me leave. It had been raining since morning, the kind of steady, dull rain that turns dirt roads into sludge and makes everything smell like wet earth and pine. I was 31 that year, and I decided to go on a solo camping trip in northern Washington. I'd been working construction for months without a single break, and I needed quiet, the kind of quiet that only the woods can give. I packed light, just my tent, sleeping bag, stove, rifle, a few cans of food, and my rain gear. I wanted nothing more than to be far from people, far from noise, far from the city lights that drowned out the stars. I drove my old pickup down a winding forest road off Route 2, somewhere past Skycomish. The GPS signal had died miles ago. The road was rough, the kind that makes you question if you're still on an actual trail or just rolling deeper into the wilderness. The rain kept slapping against the windshield, and the wipers did little more than smear the water. By the time I found a flat patch of ground near a thick cluster of cedar trees, the light had already started to fade. I parked, killed the engine, and sat there for a minute, listening to the soft ticking of the cooling metal under the sound of rain. Everything smelled damp and cold. When I stepped out, my boots sank into the mud. I grabbed my gear from the truck bed and started setting up the tent before the last bit of daylight disappeared. It was a two-person tent, old but reliable, though the seams were starting to show their age. My hands were numb by the time I got it standing. The rain never stopped. It just softened to a steady drizzle that clung to my clothes and hair. After unpacking, I built a small fire under a tarp I'd strung between two trees. The smoke drifted low and sluggish in the wet air. I warmed my hands and ate a can of chili straight from the tin. It wasn't peaceful exactly, but it was quiet. Just the sound of rain, dripping leaves, and the distant rush of a stream somewhere in the dark. It was only around 8 p.m., but the forest felt older, heavier, like it had swallowed the day whole. I turned off my lantern to let my eyes adjust to the dark. The rain made everything blurry. My tent stood a few yards away, faintly glowing from the dim light inside. I sat by the fire for a while, staring at the flicker and listening to the forest breathe. There's something about camping alone that makes you hear everything. The smallest snap, the faintest rustle. It's like your brain amplifies the world when you're out there with no walls, no people, no comfort. When I finally crawled into the tent, the rain was coming down harder again. It hit the fabric in sharp, random patterns. I zipped up the door, took off my wet jacket, and lay back on my sleeping bag. The air smelled like damp nylon and wet soil. I could still hear the fire crackling faintly outside. My flashlight lay next to me, its beam pointed toward the top of the tent, throwing a dull, yellow circle on the ceiling. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sharp sound. Not thunder, not rain, a dull thud, then another. I lay still, holding my breath. The rain had eased to a drizzle again, but something else moved outside. Slow, heavy steps. It wasn't close at first, maybe 20 feet away, but I could hear it shifting through the mud, dragging a bit like someone walking with weight in their boots. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, maybe even a bear. I reached for my rifle and slid it next to me, just in case. But then it stopped. No steps, no movement, nothing. Only the faint hiss of rain on the tent. I waited. My body felt tight, every muscle on edge. Then came another sound, a scraping noise, metal against metal. I froze. It sounded like it was coming from the truck. That sound kept going for a few seconds, then stopped again. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but something in me said not to. I turned off the flashlight and just listened. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. The woods were silent now. No insects, no rain dripping from the trees. Just silence so thick it felt like it was pressing in on me. I waited for what felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. Then I heard the crunch of footsteps again, this time closer, wet boots pressing into mud. I could hear them stop right outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. There was no talking, no light, just the sound of someone standing there in the dark. I didn't move. My hand stayed on the rifle, my finger resting on the trigger guard. The rain started picking up again, masking the faint sounds outside. After a while, I couldn't tell if I was hearing things or if the rain was just playing tricks on my mind. Then, out of nowhere, the steps started again, this time moving away. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore. Still, I didn't move. I just lay there, eyes wide open, until exhaustion finally pulled me back into an uneasy sleep. When I woke up, it was still dark but quieter. The rain had stopped. I checked my phone, 3:47 a.m. I could barely see anything through the small tent window, but the air felt colder, heavier. I unzipped the door halfway and looked out. The fire was dead, just a pile of black ash and soaked wood. My truck sat where I'd left it, but something looked off. The driver's side door was open. I got out slowly, my boots sinking in the mud again. Every step felt like it echoed in the silence. I shined my flashlight toward the truck. The inside was torn up. Glove box open, maps thrown on the seat, my backpack on the ground. I walked closer and saw deep footprints in the mud leading around the truck toward the trees. Human footprints. They weren't mine. The lock on the driver's door was busted clean through, like someone had jammed it open with a flat tool. I checked the back. My cooler was gone, along with some canned food, and the small axe I'd kept under the seat. My heart was pounding. Whoever had been there had broken into my truck while I was asleep just a few yards away. I stood there for a while, flashlight trembling in my hand, trying to think. I felt exposed, small. The forest that had felt quiet now felt alive in the worst way, like it had eyes. I packed up fast, throwing everything into the back of the truck without bothering to fold it. I just wanted out. When I started the engine, the sound felt too loud, like it didn't belong in that kind of silence. The tires spun for a second before catching on the wet ground. I drove slowly, headlights cutting through fog and branches, the rain starting again in light bursts. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they hurt. About half a mile down the road, I saw something that made me slow down. On the side of the trail, there was a tarp half covered in mud. It was mine, the one I'd strung above the fire. It looked like it had been dragged there. Next to it, there were footprints again, heading into the woods. I didn't stop. I didn't even think. I kept driving until I hit the paved road, and I didn't look back once. When I reached a small gas station at dawn, I finally got out and looked over the truck properly. The lock was ruined, the inside soaked, and my axe was still missing. The man at the counter looked at me strange when I came in, covered in mud, eyes bloodshot. I didn't explain. I just bought coffee, filled up, and drove straight home. Later that day, after I'd cleaned up and sat in my living room, I thought about it more. Someone had been out there, someone watching, waiting, maybe even following. There were no tire tracks near my camp when I arrived, no other signs of people. They must have walked in. Maybe they'd been camping nearby, maybe they'd been living out there for a while. I tried to reason with it, tell myself it was just some desperate person looking for food or tools. But the footprints, the way they stopped right outside my tent before turning back, it didn't feel like just theft. It felt like whoever it was wanted to see me first. Maybe to make sure I was alone. Maybe to make sure I wouldn't wake up. That night, back home, I couldn't sleep. The sound of rain on the window made my chest tighten. Every creak in the house pulled me back to that tent, to the silence, to the feeling of someone standing just a few feet away, waiting in the dark. I never went camping alone again after that. Not once. It was late September of 2019 when I decided to go camping alone in northern Arizona. I'd spent the whole summer working long shifts at a construction site in Flagstaff, and I wanted a quiet weekend before the weather turned cold. I packed light, just my small tent, a sleeping bag, a folding chair, a flashlight, a hatchet, and a small cooler of food. I drove my old 2003 Tacoma deep into the Coconino National Forest, way past where most campers usually stop. I didn't want to see anyone, no other cars, no campfire smoke in the distance. I wanted complete quiet. I parked near a narrow dirt trail that cut through tall pine trees. The ground was covered in dead needles, soft and damp from rain the week before. It was cold enough that when I breathed, I could see faint fog coming from my mouth. The air smelled sharp, clean, with that pine and earth scent that makes you feel both alive and small. I hiked for about 30 minutes into the woods until I found a clearing, a flat spot with a half-broken fire ring and an old fallen log someone had used as a seat before. It looked abandoned for a long time, which made it perfect. I set up my tent, gathered a small pile of dry sticks, and got a fire going before the sun dipped too low. By the time it got dark, the temperature dropped fast. The fire became my only comfort, a small circle of orange warmth surrounded by darkness. I remember the first few hours being peaceful. The forest was still, only the occasional rustle of wind moving through the tall trees. The smell of burning wood and the crackling sound helped me relax. I ate some jerky, drank a bit of water, and watched the flames. Every now and then I heard faint sounds like snapping branches far off, but I told myself it was just deer or raccoons. At some point, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone completely silent. Usually, even deep in the woods, you can hear insects, crickets, something, but all at once, everything had stopped. It was like the world had been muted. I sat there, listening, realizing how unnatural that silence felt. The fire crackled louder than before, echoing. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't help scanning the tree line with my flashlight. The light hit nothing but dark trunks and shadows. I stayed alert for a while, then convinced myself it was fine. Silence doesn't always mean danger. Sometimes nature just goes quiet. When I crawled into my tent later, I zipped it up tight, pulled my sleeping bag around me, and left the fire smoldering. It was around midnight when I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't footsteps at first, it was breathing. Soft, uneven breathing just beyond the thin tent wall. For a few seconds I froze, thinking maybe it was an animal sniffing around for food. But then the breathing changed. It became heavier, slower, and closer, like someone was standing right beside the tent. I didn't move. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The breathing stayed for maybe 10 seconds. Then there was a faint dragging sound, something moving slowly around the tent. Not walking, but dragging. I lay there, gripping my small hatchet in my hand, trying not to make any noise. The sound circled halfway around the tent and stopped. Then came a short, sharp exhale, almost like someone sighing through their nose. After that, nothing. Minutes passed. I kept listening, barely breathing. Finally, I built the courage to unzip the tent just a little and peek out. The fire outside had burned down to faint embers, giving off just enough orange light to see shapes. At first, I saw nothing, just my backpack, my chair, the shadow of the fallen log. Then, about 20 feet away between the trees, I saw something. A figure. It was tall, too tall. Its shoulders were oddly slumped forward, its limbs long and thin. It looked human at first glance, but the proportions were off. The thing stood still like it knew I was watching. My first thought was that it was some guy who had gotten lost, maybe a hunter or a drifter. But the way it stood, it wasn't normal. The head was tilted to one side, not in a curious way, but like it didn't quite understand how to hold itself up. I slowly zipped the tent shut again and held still. Every instinct in my body screamed not to make a sound. I stayed that way for what felt like hours. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again out of pure exhaustion, though I don't remember when. When I woke up, the sun was barely up. I stepped outside, shaking, still half expecting to see someone there. The ground was cold, damp, and covered with thin fog. I walked around the campsite and saw something that made my stomach drop. In the soft dirt near the back of the clearing were footprints, but they weren't right. They looked like human footprints, but too long, the toes uneven, the arches strangely deep, like the foot bent in the wrong places. There were drag marks too, like whoever made them had pulled one leg behind. I followed them a few feet into the woods until they just stopped. No more prints, no sign of anyone leaving. I told myself it was just distortion from the ground, maybe animal tracks mixing with boot prints. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I packed up fast, throwing everything into my truck without eating or even putting the fire out properly. I drove the narrow trail back to the main road as fast as I could, barely looking in the mirrors. That night, back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't really left it behind. I kept thinking about that shape standing near the trees, how still it was. I went online searching for explanations, anything that might fit. I found stories, mostly old ones, about things people called skinwalkers. I didn't want to believe it. I don't believe in supernatural stuff, never have. But the descriptions, something human but not quite right, something that moves in ways that feel wrong, those matched exactly what I saw. For days after, I couldn't sleep properly. Every little noise outside my house made me tense up. I started noticing strange things. Scratches near my back fence, my dog refusing to go into the yard after dark. that same silence sometimes falling at night, the kind that feels like pressure on your ears. I tell myself it's just my imagination, that I'm still shaken up from being alone in the woods. But part of me doesn't believe that. About a week later, I found something behind my house. I was taking the trash out early in the morning when I noticed muddy prints by the side of the gate. They looked like footprints again, but not shoes. Bare feet, long ones. I followed them a few steps until they faded into the dirt road. There was no reason for anyone to be walking barefoot out there, not in late September. That same night, I set up a motion light by the fence. Around 2 a.m., it went off. I looked out my window and saw nothing, just the light swinging slightly as if something had passed under it. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I found the gate slightly open, even though I always lock it. I don't go camping anymore. I sold most of my gear the next month. The woods used to be peaceful to me. Now the idea of being alone out there makes my skin crawl. I've tried to convince myself that what I saw was just a man. Maybe someone with a deformity or someone high and wandering through the forest. But the truth is, I can't explain it. The way it stood there, the sound of that breathing, the shape of those footprints, it doesn't fit anything I know. Sometimes I think about driving back there, just to see if the clearing still looks the same. But I never do. I know better now. There are things out there that look human, but aren't. Things that watch quietly, learning how to move like us. And once you see one, you don't forget it. You carry that image with you, the wrongness of it, every time you step outside at night. I don't tell people this story anymore. It sounds crazy, and I don't blame anyone who doesn't believe it. But every time I see a motion light flicker in my backyard, or I hear something dragging softly against the wall, I remember that night in the forest, the silence, the shape between the trees, and I realize some things don't stay behind in the woods. Some things follow you home. It was late October 2017. I was 34 at the time, and I'd taken a week off work to go hunting in the northern parts of Montana. I'd been hunting since I was a teenager, and I liked being away from everything. No traffic, no people, no phone signal, just woods, cold air, and silence. I'd been to this area before, a stretch of rough land surrounded by pine forest and a small river that curved through the valley. It was about an hour's drive off the main road, then another hour walking into the trees. That year I went alone. My usual hunting partner, Tyler, had a new kid and couldn't make it, so I figured I'd go solo. I packed light, a tent, my rifle, a few days worth of food, a sleeping bag, and a small cooler. I knew how to handle myself in the woods, and I liked the quiet. The first 2 days were uneventful. Cold mornings, crisp air, and the occasional sound of birds or branches cracking under small animals. I didn't see much game, but that didn't bother me. It was just good to be out there. By the third day, the weather changed. The wind picked up, and a gray haze rolled through the valley. The kind of overcast that makes everything look the same shade of dull green and gray. The temperature dropped fast, and by evening, I could see my breath hanging in the air. I built a small fire, ate a simple meal, and sat by the flames, staring into the dark tree line. The woods always look different at night, like they're watching you back. I woke up around 3 a.m. that night to the sound of something moving near the tent. Not loud, just small crunches of leaves. I stayed still, listening. It was slow, like something creeping, pausing every few seconds. I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. The noise stopped for a long minute, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Then it started again, closer. I turned on the light and flashed it toward the noise, but there was nothing. Just trees and fog hanging low. I sat awake for a while after that, listening, but it never came back. The next morning, I found tracks near the tent. Not animal tracks, These were boots, fresh, pressed into the damp dirt from last night's mist. They circled around the tent twice, then disappeared into the trees. My stomach dropped when I saw them. The prints weren't mine. I could see that clearly. They were larger, heavier. I told myself maybe it was a hunter passing through, checking the area, but it didn't make sense. No one hikes this deep in without a truck or at least leaving signs of camp nearby, and I hadn't heard a single engine for days. I packed my things slower that morning, more aware of the silence. Every sound seemed louder now. The wind in the trees, the creak of branches, even my own footsteps. I decided to move camp a few miles north near a small clearing by the river. I hiked most of the morning, keeping an eye out for any sign of people, but found nothing. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in wet pine needles. By noon, I reached the clearing and set up my tent again. The river nearby made a low, constant sound that covered most of the forest noise, and for a few hours I felt okay again. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time it wasn't close, but it was clear. Something walking through the forest, slow but steady. The footsteps were heavy, far apart. I sat up in my sleeping bag, holding my rifle. I could see faint shadows moving beyond the edge of the trees, like someone pacing just far enough to stay unseen. I didn't turn on the light this time. I just waited. The footsteps circled around, paused, then faded away into the distance. By morning, I barely felt like myself. My eyes were heavy, my head ached, and my nerves were shot. I found more boot prints near the clearing, coming from the trees and stopping a few feet from where my tent was. Whoever it was had stood there for a while. The dirt was packed deeper, like they'd been standing still, watching. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I broke down camp and started heading back toward the truck. It was a long hike back over 6 miles of uneven terrain. The woods were thick, and the fog didn't lift all day. I could barely see 20 feet ahead at times. About halfway through, I stopped by a fallen log to rest and drink some water. That's when I heard it again. The same slow, dragging footsteps behind me. I turned fast, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Then I saw movement, a shape between the trees. Too big for an animal, too steady. It wasn't running, just walking the same direction I'd come from. I started walking faster, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. Every time I looked back, I'd catch a glimpse of something. A dark figure, far enough to stay hidden but close enough that I knew it was there. The woods were dead quiet except for my breathing and that steady crunch of leaves behind me. I didn't stop again. By the time I reached the area where I'd parked, it was already late afternoon. The light was fading fast, and the sky was the color of ash. My truck sat exactly where I'd left it, but when I got closer, I noticed something was wrong. The driver's side door was open a few inches. My heart started pounding. I hadn't left it like that. I could see faint scuff marks on the dirt near the tires, and the inside of the truck looked disturbed. My bag had been moved, and the glove compartment was open. I stood there for a long minute, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but I could feel that same pressure in the air, like someone was nearby. I opened the door, slid inside, and started the engine. The headlights lit up the trees ahead, and that's when I saw it, just for a second. A man standing between the trees, half hidden in the fog. Tall, wearing a dark jacket, his face pale, eyes fixed right on the truck. He didn't move, just stood there watching. I didn't wait. I slammed the gas pedal and drove down that dirt road as fast as the truck could handle. Branches hit the sides, rocks crunched under the tires, and I didn't slow down until I reached the paved road. When I finally stopped, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. I sat there for a long time, headlights cutting into the empty road, trying to process what had just happened. When I got back to town, I went straight to the local sheriff's office and told them everything. They sent 2 deputies up there the next morning. Later that day, they called me back and said they found signs of someone camping not far from where I'd been. An old tarp, some food wrappers, and boot prints matching the ones I'd seen. But whoever it was, they were gone. No vehicle, no name, no clue who they might have been. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep right. Every noise outside my window made me jump. I stopped going hunting for almost 2 years after that trip. When I finally did go again, I stuck to public campsites, places where I could see other people nearby. Even now, I still think about those tracks, about the man in the fog, and how quiet the woods were that morning before I left. There was no reason for him to be there, no cabins nearby, no roads for miles. He wasn't lost. He wasn't looking for help. He'd been following me for at least 2 days, watching my camp at night, standing outside my tent. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that first night, if I hadn't moved camps, if I'd waited just one more day before heading back. I've told a few people this story over the years, and they always try to explain it. Some say it was just another hunter, some say maybe a drifter. But the thing that stays with me isn't the footprints or the tent or even seeing him that last time. It's the way he stood there, still as a tree, like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. And the worst part is knowing he wasn't surprised when I did. It was my second day in the Amazon, and things were already feeling off. I had come here alone, hoping to disconnect and explore the jungle. I'd been told it was the best way to find peace, away from the hustle of city life. The air was thick with humidity, the dense foliage almost suffocating in its greenness. I had set up my camp near the bank of a slow-moving river. The water, brown and muddy, mirrored the trees towering overhead. The air smelled like damp earth with a hint of rotting leaves. The ground was uneven, and I had to make sure I set up my tent on higher ground in case the rain came down hard. It wasn't the first time I'd been camping in wild places, but it was my first time alone in the heart of a place as untamed as this. I wasn't scared, or at least I told myself I wasn't. There's a strange confidence that comes with being on your own in the wilderness, as if you can handle anything nature throws at you. The sun had barely set on that second night when I started hearing strange noises. At first, I thought it was just the jungle coming alive. Monkeys in the trees, the occasional rustling of a small animal moving through the brush. But as the darkness deepened, the sounds started to feel more deliberate, closer than anything I had heard before. I sat still in my tent, the flap half open, just enough for me to peek out. The jungle outside was black as pitch, with only the moonlight filtering through the canopy above. But even in the darkness, I could feel the presence of something or someone out there. The sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush, slow and measured, like they were deliberately circling my camp. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. No animal moved like that, at least none that I knew of. I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself that it was probably another camper. Someone lost, maybe. But then, a chilling thought crossed my mind. No one else was supposed to be out here. I had been told that the area was remote, and there were no other camps nearby. Yet the sound was unmistakable. Someone was out there. I reached for the knife I kept next to me in the tent, a dull comfort against the growing fear creeping in my gut. I had no intention of confronting whoever was out there, but I wasn't about to leave myself unarmed either. The footsteps came closer, and then, abruptly, they stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing, the beat of my pulse in my ears. I sat perfectly still, waiting, straining to hear any sign of movement. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl. Not an animal growl, but something deeper, more unsettling, like the sound came from something human. My body went cold. my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the knife harder. I wasn't sure if it was just my mind playing tricks on me or if there really was someone out there. But in that moment, I knew one thing. I needed to get out of there. I slowly unzipped the flap of my tent, careful not to make a sound. My breath caught in my throat as I peered into the darkness, trying to make out any shape or movement. The jungle seemed to hold its breath with me, the sounds of the night suspended in silence. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring into the blackness, but when I finally worked up the courage to step outside, I almost wished I hadn't. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and rotting wood, and the sound of distant water flowing was the only thing breaking the oppressive silence. But as I stepped away from the tent, I noticed something in the dirt, a footprint. It was large, and it didn't look like anything I had seen before. The shape of it was wrong, as though whatever made it had no real regard for how it stepped. I crouched down to get a closer look, my heart hammering in my chest. It was fresh, the edges of the print still sharp. Then, a sudden crack of a twig to my right snapped me back into reality. My head whipped toward the noise, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. A figure, tall and hunched, moving between the trees. It was too quick to make out clearly, but I knew one thing. It was no animal. No animal moved like that. My pulse spiked, and without thinking, I grabbed my backpack and threw it over my shoulder, making sure to zip my tent back up as I did. I needed to move. I couldn't stay here. I moved swiftly, but I tried to stay quiet, my feet crunching on the wet leaves beneath me. I had no idea where I was going, but I couldn't stay in one place. I couldn't let whoever or whatever was out there find me. I pushed through the thick underbrush, the branches catching on my clothes, the mosquitoes buzzing around my face. The further I moved, the more disoriented I became. The jungle, while beautiful, had a way of making everything look the same. The trees, the vines, the patches of wet ground. It all blended together in a confusing maze. I came across the river again, and for a moment I thought I might follow it downstream, but the sound of movement in the trees was getting closer. I didn't have time to think. My only option was to keep moving. I don't know how long I walked through the dark, my mind racing, my body exhausted. I knew I was lost. I knew I was no longer sure of where I was, or which direction I was heading. The sounds in the jungle, once distant, now felt suffocating. But still, I pressed on, feeling like I was being watched every second. Eventually, I stumbled across a clearing, and in the pale moonlight, I saw something that made my heart stop. Another camp. Not a big one, but there were signs of recent use. A small fire pit, a tarp strung between two trees, a few scattered belongings. I was hesitant, but I approached cautiously, hoping against hope that it might be someone like me. Just another camper trying to make it through the night. But when I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach turn. There was a jacket on the ground, torn and stained. A backpack, half open, its contents spilled out like someone had left in a hurry. I looked around, but there was no one in sight, no sign of life at all. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized something. Whoever had been here, they had left in a hurry, and they had left because they were running from something. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay here, not knowing what had happened to the person who had been here. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, the same low growl. And this time it was much closer. I bolted. I ran faster than I ever thought I could, my legs burning, my breath ragged in my chest. I didn't stop until I came across a small wooden hut near the edge of the jungle. It was run down, barely standing, but it was a shelter, and it was a sign that maybe someone lived nearby. I knocked on the door, hoping to find help, but when the door creaked open, I was greeted by an old man, his eyes wide with surprise. He didn't speak at first, but when he saw my face, pale and covered in dirt, he stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. He didn't ask any questions. He just gave me food and water, and we stayed silent. After a while, I managed to tell him about the noises, the footprint, and the growl. He nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting it. "It's not safe out there," he said. "You were lucky to find me." That night, I stayed in the hut, my mind still racing with what had happened. In the morning, I would leave the jungle. I didn't know what had been out there with me, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going back. I still think about that camping trip sometimes, even though it's been years. It was late August of 2014. I was 28, and I had been driving across the country by myself after quitting a job that I'd hated for too long. I wanted some space before starting over, so I packed my old Ford Escape with a tent, cooler, and just enough food to last me a week or two. My plan was simple: drive west from North Carolina, stop wherever it looked quiet, camp a few nights, and move on. Somewhere in Arkansas, I left the main highway and took a long, winding road that led toward Ozark National Forest. I had found a small creek campground marked on an old map I kept in the glove box. It wasn't a popular one, which was exactly what I wanted. I reached it late in the afternoon, around 5:30, when the sunlight started turning gold through the trees. The place was nearly empty. Just one old pickup parked near the entrance, but no tents or people in sight. I figured maybe someone was hiking. The campground sat right beside a shallow creek, maybe 10 feet wide, running slow and clear. The sound of the water was soft, and there were thick woods on both sides, so dense you couldn't see more than 30 feet in. The ground was covered with dead leaves and pine needles. I parked near a flat patch close to the water and started setting up my tent. Felt peaceful. The air smelled like wet dirt and cedar. I cooked a can of beans over my small stove and ate sitting on a log, watching the creek move lazily. I remember thinking that this was exactly what I had needed, to be away from people, phones, and the noise of everything. When it got dark, it got really dark. There weren't any nearby cabins or campfires. No hum of traffic, just the sound of the creek and the faint rustling of leaves when the wind moved through. I had a small flashlight, but I didn't use it much. I liked the quiet. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and fell asleep listening to crickets. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up without knowing why. I lay there, half asleep, listening. The crickets were still chirping, but there was another sound, soft, irregular splashes. It was coming from the creek, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer crossing. Still, I stayed awake for a while, listening to it move slowly through the water. Eventually, it stopped, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sky was gray, though, and it felt more humid. I made coffee, packed a sandwich, and went for a short hike up a nearby trail that followed the creek. The woods were beautiful but thick. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. So quiet that I could hear my own breathing. After maybe half an hour, I found something strange. A small fire ring made from stones, not old but freshly used. The ashes were still black, not gray. There were beer cans scattered around and what looked like a piece of an old blanket half buried in mud. It didn't bother me much at the time. I figured some locals had camped there recently. But when I followed the trail back and reached my campsite, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. My tent flap was unzipped. I was sure I had zipped it before leaving. Inside, nothing seemed stolen, but my sleeping bag was moved, and one of my socks was missing. Just one. I told myself maybe I'd left the flap open by mistake. It didn't feel right, but I pushed it aside. I stayed busy, gathered some firewood, and cooked dinner early. By dusk, the forest started feeling heavier, like the air had thickened. I could smell rain coming, that wet earth scent before a storm. I decided to turn in early and zipped the tent carefully this time, double-checking it. That night, I woke again. The rain had started, light at first, tapping against the tent. But underneath the sound of rain, there was something else. Footsteps, slow, soft ones. I froze, heart pounding. They were close, on the wet leaves just outside. The steps stopped. Then I heard a quiet, dragging noise, like something being pulled. I didn't move. I just listened, trying to make sense of it. The sound went around the back of my tent, paused, and then faded into the rain. I stayed awake for at least an hour, barely breathing, clutching my pocket knife even though I knew it wouldn't do much. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep again. When I woke up at dawn, the rain had stopped, and fog was thick over the creek. The first thing I saw was a footprint outside my tent, barefoot, large, deep in the mud. It wasn't an animal. Someone had been there. I wanted to leave right then, but my car wouldn't start. I turned the key and got nothing but a dull click. The battery wasn't dead the day before. I popped the hood and checked the cables. They were fine, but the terminal caps looked like they'd been loosened. Not completely, but enough that the connection wouldn't hold. Someone had messed with it. I tightened them by hand, started the car, and just sat there for a while, staring at the trees. I couldn't see anyone, but I had that feeling, that heavy sense of being watched. I packed up fast, threw everything into the back, half wet and muddy, and drove off without even checking if I left anything behind. I followed the dirt road out of the campground, but after about half a mile, I hit a small bridge over the creek, and something made me stop. There was a bag sitting right in the middle of the bridge, an old duffel bag, dark green, soaked from the rain. I didn't get out. I just looked at it through the windshield. Part of me wanted to move it, but something deep inside told me not to. I backed the car slowly, turned onto a side trail that went uphill, and didn't stop driving until I hit the main road an hour later. I ended up spending that night in a cheap motel near Russellville. When I finally calmed down enough to check my stuff, I realized a few small things were missing. A flashlight, a pair of socks, and the small hunting knife I kept in the side pocket of my pack. Nothing expensive, but enough to know that someone had definitely been in my tent. The next day, out of some weird need for closure, I drove to a nearby ranger station to report what had happened. The ranger there, a tall guy in his 50s, listened quietly and nodded like it wasn't the first time he'd heard something like that. He told me some of those deep forest sites weren't patrolled often and that sometimes people, squatters, drifters, or illegal hunters, used them. He said a few campers over the past year had reported waking up to find their tents opened or their stuff missing, but nothing ever led to arrests. The forest was too big, and whoever did it knew the land better than anyone. He told me it was good I left when I did. I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. Even now, when I drive through wooded areas and see a creek or an empty pull-off, I get that same tight feeling in my stomach. I still think about the footprint, the bag on the bridge, and how easily it could have gone worse. Sometimes I wonder if the person had been watching me since the first night, waiting for the right time. Maybe they were camping deeper in the woods, watching that quiet little spot for days. Maybe they wanted food or tools, or maybe they just liked scaring people. I'll never know, but I do know one thing: I wasn't alone out there, not even for a second. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to go camping alone in the Lake District in northern England. I was 26 at the time and had recently started getting into solo hiking and wild camping. I liked the quiet, the way the air felt cleaner out there, and how it made me forget about city noise and work. I packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, a camping stove, and some basic food. I left early in the morning and drove up from Manchester, reaching a small lay-by near Ullswater around noon. The sky was pale and clear, the kind of day that looked harmless. I parked near a trail that led deep into a stretch of forest and hills. There weren't many people around, just a few cars left behind by hikers. The trail wasn't an official camping site, but wild camping is allowed in most parts of the area if you stay low-key. I walked for a few hours, following a narrow track through tall grass and wet soil, the sound of water running in the distance. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I found a small clearing near a stream that looked perfect for the night. It was tucked away from the trail and surrounded by trees, which made it feel private. I set up my tent, boiled some water for noodles, and just sat there for a while, listening to the faint rustling of leaves. It was peaceful. I remember thinking that I could stay there for a few days easily. The sun dropped behind the trees around 8, and the light turned golden. The forest got quiet in that heavy kind of way that makes every sound seem sharper. When I went to wash my pot in the stream, I noticed something strange. Across the water, maybe 30 or 40 meters away, there was a man standing still. He was wearing a brown jacket and dark trousers. His face was partly hidden by the low light and the angle, but I could see his hair, short and gray. He wasn't moving, just standing and facing my direction. At first, I thought maybe he was another camper or a hiker, maybe looking for a place to set up. I raised my hand slightly out of habit, but he didn't move. He didn't even seem to notice. I tried not to think too much of it and went back to my tent. After a few minutes, I looked out again, but the man was gone. I assumed he must have walked off down the stream. Still, something about the way he had been standing there felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. By nightfall, the forest went almost pitch black. There was no moon that night, just a faint mist starting to form near the ground. I sat inside my tent with my flashlight and tried to read for a bit, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something. A twig snapping or the faint crunch of footsteps on damp soil. I told myself it was just deer or badgers moving around. Around midnight, I heard it again, but closer this time. Slow steps, uneven, as if someone was walking carefully but not quietly enough. I turned off my flashlight and sat still, listening. The steps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, not animal breathing, but the kind of slow, heavy breathing that comes from a person standing close. My heart started pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I didn't move. I just waited. The sound stayed there for what felt like a minute or two, then slowly started fading away toward the trees. I sat in silence for another hour before I dared to unzip the tent and peek out. The mist had thickened, curling around the trees. I couldn't see anyone. My torchlight caught only the white haze and the damp grass. I hardly slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that man standing outside, watching. When the sky started to lighten, I packed my things quickly. I didn't even make breakfast. I wanted to be out of there as soon as possible. The trail was damp from morning dew, and everything looked dull and washed out. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me, but the path stayed empty. About half an hour into the walk back, I noticed footprints on the trail. They were fresh, clearly pressed into the mud after the light rain that had fallen late in the night. At first, I thought they might have been mine from the day before, but these were larger and led toward my campsite, not away from it. Whoever had made them had come from the direction of the road after I'd set up camp. That detail made my stomach drop. I started walking faster, almost jogging. When I finally reached the small lay-by, there was only my car and another, an old, dirty Land Rover parked a few meters away. The windows were tinted, and there was mud splattered high up the sides, like it had been driven off-road recently. I didn't see anyone around. I threw my bag in the back seat and started the engine. Just as I was about to pull out, I saw movement in the mirror. A man stepping out from behind the Land Rover. It was the same man from last night. Same brown jacket, same still posture. He just stood there watching my car. I didn't wait. I pressed the pedal and drove off, checking the mirrors every few seconds. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely keep the car steady. I didn't stop until I reached a small petrol station about 20 minutes away. I parked near the front and just sat there for a while, trying to calm down. When I finally looked back, there was no sign of him. That evening, when I got home, I still couldn't get the image out of my head. Him standing across the stream, then outside my tent, then behind that car. It didn't make sense. I tried to convince myself that maybe he was just another camper who happened to be around the same area. Maybe someone who got lost or was just weird. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. 2 days later, I decided to check something. I went online to see if there were any reports or stories about strange encounters or crimes in that area. It took a while, but I found a short local article about a missing hiker from around the same region. Last seen near Ullswater, a few weeks before I went there. The article mentioned that the man's tent had been found abandoned, his gear still inside. There was no sign of him. I stared at that article for a long time. The description of where they found the tent, it was almost the same area where I had camped. I didn't know what to do with that information. I didn't tell anyone, not even my friends. What would I even say? That I might have seen the person responsible? That a stranger stood outside my tent at night, breathing through the mist, and I just froze? For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep properly. Every small sound at night would wake me. I started keeping a flashlight by my bed. Even though I lived in a small flat in the middle of the city, I deleted the camping photos from my phone and sold most of my gear. I haven't gone camping since. Sometimes I still think about that man. The way he just watched and didn't move. The way those footprints led straight to my camp. I think about how quiet it was, how I could hear his breathing through the thin fabric of my tent. And the part that scares me most isn't that he found me. It's that he left. That he could have done anything, but for some reason, he didn't. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he was waiting for something. Maybe he was just trying to scare me. But every time I picture his face in that early morning light, the way he stood by that Land Rover, motionless and calm, I can't help thinking. He wasn't surprised to see me drive off. It almost felt like he expected me to, like he'd done this before, and somewhere out there, maybe he still is. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to go camping alone in northern Minnesota. I'd been doing short solo trips for a couple of years, nothing extreme, but enough to feel comfortable in the woods. That weekend, I drove out to a quiet area near the Rainy River, not far from the Canadian border. I picked that spot because it was isolated, far from campsites, and I wanted a few days of silence. No phone signal, no people, just trees, water, and cold air. The forecast said light rain and low temperatures, but I didn't mind. I packed light: a tent, a sleeping bag, some dry food, a small propane stove, and my old hunting knife. I arrived just before sunset. The air was cold, and the ground was already covered with damp leaves. The trees were mostly bare, their branches sharp against the gray sky. I parked my truck on a narrow dirt road that looked barely used, grabbed my backpack, and hiked about a mile toward the river. The sound of running water grew louder until I found a clearing close to the bank. The ground was soft, covered in dead pine needles, perfect for a tent. I set it up quickly and gathered some fallen wood to start a small fire. As the fire crackled, I sat on a log eating a can of beans straight from the tin. The river looked dark and slow under the fading light. Across it, the forest was dense and quiet, not even the sound of birds. It was that kind of silence where you could hear your own heartbeat. I remember thinking it felt peaceful but also heavy, like something was watching. But that's a common feeling when you're alone in the woods. Every sound feels louder than it should be. When darkness finally came, I climbed into my tent and lay back in my sleeping bag. The wind was moving softly through the trees. I could hear the river's current and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the woods. I wasn't scared, just alert, the way you get when your brain knows you're alone and wants to remind you that you're fragile out there. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind and water. I woke up in the middle of the night to something heavy moving near the tent. It wasn't the small sound of a squirrel or a raccoon. It was something slow, dragging its feet. I froze and listened. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, giving off a faint red light through the tent fabric. I heard a crunch of leaves, then nothing, just the wind again. I waited, barely breathing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was probably a deer and rolled over, trying to go back to sleep. The next morning, the ground outside the tent was damp from dew, and the fire pit was full of ash. I walked down to the river to wash my face, and that's when I saw it. Across the river, maybe 50 yards away, there was something that looked like a pile of clothes or maybe a sleeping bag tangled in the bushes. It was dark green, almost blending into the background. I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out what it was. I thought maybe another camper had been there before me and left gear behind. Later that day, I went fishing a bit downstream and caught a small perch. I cooked it on the fire and ate it with bread. The air stayed cloudy, and it felt colder than before. Around late afternoon, I went back to the riverbank. That green shape across the river was still there, but now it looked slightly different, like it had shifted or moved a bit closer to the edge of the trees. I thought maybe it was an animal's den or some tarp that had blown over, but the more I looked at it, the less sure I became. That night, it started raining. The sound of the water on the tent was steady and loud. I read for a while by flashlight until I got tired. When I turned it off, the world went pitch black. The rain got heavier. Around midnight, I heard something again outside, closer this time. It was slow steps circling the tent. I could hear water dripping off whatever it was. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the rain. I grabbed my knife and sat up, waiting. The steps stopped right outside, maybe 2 feet away. I could hear breathing, deep, uneven, wet breathing, like someone had been running for too long. Then it moved off slowly into the woods. I sat there for a long time, gripping the knife, listening until the sounds faded. I didn't sleep after that. I just waited for daylight. When the sun came up, everything was soaked. My boots were wet, and my hands were shaking from the cold. I walked around the tent to check the ground. There were footprints in the mud, bare footprints, human but large and wide, the toes spread out. The sight made my stomach twist. They led from the trees to my tent and then back toward the river. I followed them for a while until they disappeared near the bank. Across the river, that green shape was gone. I felt sick. I started packing my gear right away. I didn't care about the rain or the cold. I just wanted to leave. But when I reached the spot where I'd parked my truck, something else made me stop. There were more footprints near it. Muddy ones, like whoever or whatever had walked there during the night had circled my truck too. The door handles were covered in dirt, like someone had tried to open them. My keys were in my pocket, but that detail chilled me more than anything else. Whoever it was had been close enough to touch everything I owned. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The road was slick and narrow, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. I drove about 5 miles before stopping near a small service road to calm down. My hands were still trembling. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw how pale I was. When I finally got back to town, I went to a small diner to eat something warm. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. I tried to come up with explanations. Maybe some drunk hunter got lost. Maybe a local man living off-grid wandered through. But none of those ideas fit with what I'd seen or heard. Those prints were barefoot in freezing weather, and the way that thing moved around the tent wasn't normal. It wasn't cautious like an animal or clumsy like a drunk person. It was deliberate, knew I was there. A few days later, when I calmed down a little, I drove back up near that area to see if I could find anything. Not to camp, just to check. I parked on the main road this time and walked a little way toward where my old camp had been. I didn't go all the way, but from the distance, I could see something hanging from a tree across the river. It looked like a piece of green fabric flapping in the wind, torn and dirty. I realized then it must have been that same thing I saw the first morning. The pile that had looked like clothes, only now it looked more like a jacket. That's when it hit me. Maybe it wasn't a random object. Maybe it was a person the whole time. Someone lying still, maybe hiding, maybe waiting. Maybe that was who had walked around my tent. I didn't go any closer. I turned back to the truck and left. I never told anyone the full story, not even my brother who used to go hunting with me. I stopped camping alone after that. Sometimes, when I drive through rural areas or past rivers with thick woods around them, I think about that night. The sound of the steps, the breathing, those wide footprints in the mud. And I wonder if the person, or whatever it was, still lives out there, walking barefoot through the cold forest, watching campers who think they're alone. I've tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination or maybe some hermit who didn't want to be found. But I can still remember that smell in the air that night. A mix of wet soil and something sour, something human. I've never been able to explain it, and maybe I don't want to, because whatever it wasn't supposed to be there. Not in that silence. Not that close.